Hi, welcome to Amy's Book Nook. This is a channel where I get to chat to people about books. I am still on furlough. During our sort of third lockdown, I've managed to get quite a lot of reading done, which is really exciting. First lockdown, I was so distracted. I was reading really slowly, but I've seemed to pick up the pace, and that's been a lot of fun. I wanted to put a video up as a sort of follow along from the previous one I did on Discovering Dystopia, which is essentially an introduction to the dystopian fiction book club that I facilitate through Waterstones in Cambridge. And essentially what I wanted to do was go on from having given an introduction to utopia and dystopian fiction, and then move to talking specifically about some of the novels that we discussed. So this video is all about quickly sort of giving bullet points and an outline to Orwell's 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Before diving in, I think it's worth reviewing a few of the questions about, what is utopia? Who is utopia for? And what does it look like? Like, how are things structured to make utopia possible? In her introduction to Brave New World, Margaret Atwood posits questions in different ways, which I think is really helpful in thinking about how these societies differ. She asks, where do people live? What do they eat? What do they wear? What do they do about sex and child rearing? Who has the power? Who does the work? And how do citizens relate to nature? And how does the economy function? It's worth keeping those questions in mind because, Orwell, Huxley, and Atwood have very different society structures, and they answer things like, where do people live and what do they do about sex in very, very different ways, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. Anyway, so George Orwell, 1984. Orwell was born in India in 1903. His family moved back to England and he went to Eton. He lived in Burma, Paris, London, Spain, Morocco. So it's worth keeping in mind that he did travel around quite a bit, and he did so in sort of war-torn areas. So it was in a military capacity that he was in Burma, and that experience informed his earlier piece, Burmese Days. And he wrote a nonfiction piece, Down and Out, in Paris and London, where he's talking about poverty and the effects of war. And so it's just, it's really interesting to keep those concepts in relationship to those historical contexts. His political allegory, Animal Farm, came out in 1945 and really put him on the map in terms of his contemporaries. And his novel 1984 was written in 48 and came out in 49, but he actually became ill in 48, 49, and he passed away in 1950s. So 1948 is really his sort of legacy piece in a lot of senses. So I just think it's worth keeping in mind that as he was writing, he certainly had that firsthand experience of imperialism and war. In 1984, we have a society that's governed by an authoritarian party. Our protagonist's name is Winston Smith. His job is to rewrite history, essentially. So whenever whenever the government puts out a new edict that contradicts something that was in the past, they delete all of the information and rewrite history so that it all complies with what is currently being perpetuated by the government. So really, as a plot point, really fascinating to think about things in terms of truth and knowledge, and choice and free will become a big part. What does it mean to be an individual versus part of this collective? And then surveillance, of course. Even if you haven't read the piece, you're probably familiar with Big Brother. Big Brother is watching you. This idea that you're always meant to comply and always being observed. Definitely the themes that come up in the novel. We also get the character of Julia, who has a relationship with Winston, and the tensions of their relationship, I think, sort of peel back some of the larger tensions that are happening within the society. I guess I don't really want to give away too many spoilers, but these things go in parallelly. His increased individuality is typified in his relationship with Julia. I'll just leave that there. So key features of the novel: the idea of Big Brother, thought police, you get news speak, and the propaganda slogans: ignorance is strength, war is peace. So those are the sort of main key elements, things to keep in mind when thinking about 1984. Huxley's Brave New World. Huxley was born in 1894 in Surrey. His grandfather is a biologist who championed Darwin's theories, actually. And we can certainly see the influence of science in this piece. He did travel a bit as well. He lived in Italy in the 1920s and then in France in the 1930s. He also traveled to America via India, I think is how somebody wrote it down, which I thought, that's a strange sort of way around. Anyway, and that was in 25-26. So, and apparently it was his time in America that he became really discouraged about culture and society, and it informed his writing of Brave New World, which he composed in 1931 and was published in 1932. But he wrote it while he was in Britain as opposed to while he was in the US. Again, it's worth noting that this is during the sort of interwar period, which is quite difficult. We have the rise of communism in places like Russia, as well as rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. So these are tensions that are the background to this novel. In Brave New World, the very first scene is that we walk into what's called the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, where we learn essentially how society works, which is that reproduction takes place in this laboratory. The genes are developed in a very specific way, and that is how they get their caste system. It's based on how the genes are prepared. So they have alpha, betas, deltas, and I think epsilons. So we're immediately introduced to these ideas about reproduction and class distinction. We're also introduced to the social construct of being sort of anti-monogamy. In, one of the tensions is that the central female character spending too much exclusive time with one other person. She really should be sleeping around more. And that is why she starts hanging out with Bernard, who she thinks is really weird. Our main protagonist is this Bernard Marx. He, like Winston, also has sort of resists the system through this increased individuality. It's typified, instead of a relationship with a woman, a little bit with the relationship with the woman, but to my mind, it's really typified by his interest in John Savage, who's a complex and really interesting character, but is essentially a sort of antithesis. He is the person who has grown up outside of this government and instead on one of these as soon as I read it, I was like, it's an Indian reservation, essentially. But there are these pockets of communities that aren't in the sort of overwhelming the governed civilization, and Bernard essentially brings him back as a kind of experiment. It's very strange, but some of the key themes that come out are the idea of pleasure. So everybody has a job, so there is labor, but you also are given soma pills, so things that create these intense pleasure. And there's the idea of the group conforming to the group versus being the individual, and things are made so that they can that do fall apart so that they can be replaced. So materialism and capitalism also come to the fore for sure. So the soma pills, a huge feature, something that's quite memorable about the novel. I find it really particular that mother is a curse word in this novel, and again, that shows you the idea of what reproduction means in this society. And also, there are a ton of Shakespeare references. I mean, Oh Brave New World, so the title comes from The Tempest, and John Savage, has read Shakespeare, and in this sort of penultimate scene, we have one of the world controllers talking about art and science and religion and why you can't have tragedy in what he calls a stable society. So again, art and literature playing a really interesting role there. Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. I think this is one of the earlier covers, and I really like that one. She was born in Canada in 1939. She's a poet, novelist, essayist. Her father is a professor of zoology. You see a lot of ecological concerns in her novels. She studied at Toronto with Northrop Frye, who is a big sort of literary theory figure. Talks about the Bible as the Great Code. It's sort of his big contribution to literary theory. In 1961, she studied at Radcliffe in Boston, which essentially became part of Harvard a little bit later on. And she wrote The Handmaid's Tale in 1985. So thank Reagan, thank Thatcher. I think it's interesting to note also that when she was at Harvard, women weren't allowed to use the Lamont Library. And there was also the tension of being a Canadian and going to the US, and people from the US not really considering Canada anything other than the place where the bad weather comes from. So we get these sort of national tensions and gender tensions in her piece for sure. So in The Handmaid's Tale, we have an unnamed protagonist who is the handmaid for a powerful family in the Republic of Gilead. The Republic of Gilead emerged as a result of an ecological disaster that had made for human fertility to plummet. So this conservative religious group sort of has a coup, takes over this certain area. Women are no longer allowed to have property, they're sort of re-educated, and any woman who had previously had a child and is therefore proven to be fertile is taken in as a handmaid. We get flashbacks to previous times, but I think the opening scene is really fascinating here. We get a woman who's essentially just lying in a bed looking up at a ceiling, and then later on walks down the hall. And yet the way that she reflects on the space around her is so endemic of the society in which she lives in, and the violence that is sort of suggested in every area of life. A couple of key features. So themes are of surveillance as well, because there's the eye, and she can't really go anywhere except she can go to the store and get things that she has tickets for. It's all very controlled, and one of the main conflicts is our protagonist's increased individuality, but more specifically the individuality of her as a woman. So questions of gender are certainly at the fore, as well as reproduction. The phrase "blessed be the fruit," now famous probably from the Hulu series, is identified with that novel. And another feature of the novel is it ends with something called historical notes. So the narrator's narrative is essentially cut off at some point, and we realize that we've only learned about this story through these discovered tapes. And so there's sort of this really humorous academic symposium going on, and they're sort of contextualizing the story for us. So I think there's another level of how is our narrator's story really being told and interpreted, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, we've already seen a huge range of of the ways in which societies are set up, and the elements that of a society that are being critiqued by these different dystopias. So I just wanted to put those sort of thoughts and themes in your mind as you think about dystopian fiction. And for anyone who wants to join the dystopian fiction book club, you will hopefully not feel sort of left out of the conversation as you've given sort of the Cliff's Notes to the discussion for those 3 novels. So thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again soon, and yeah, take care.